Could it be that you've misunderstood the entire point of the Gospels? The scholar Dennis Macdonald thinks so. Instead of the Gospels aiming to tell us about the historical Jesus, they were trying to rework the epics of Homer to create theological fiction. Jesus was modeled after characters like Odysseus and Hector from Homer's epics. The Gospels were never intended to be history. Mark was an artist uninhibited in his creation of theological fiction. Luke created each of these stories as fiction to imitate or emulate famous stories in the Iliad and without the benefit of pre-existing traditions. Therefore, we need to stop believing the Gospels are historical records of who Jesus was. They are just fictional works. Macdonald lists several places where he thinks the Gospels intentionally rework stories from Homer to support his theory. But when we evaluate his claims, we encounter numerous problems. There is a reason the majority of scholars who have reviewed his work come away rejecting his ideas. And as we cover some examples, you'll see why the Gospels are not theological fiction based on Homer. Macdonald claims that Mark directly imitated parts of the Odyssey and Iliad. Luke built on this and imitated more throughout his works. As noted, this was intentional. Macdonald's view is these New Testament authors were purposely reworking Homer to create fictional accounts of Jesus. He argues both Jesus and Odysseus are heroes, carpenters not honored at home but abroad, go on journeys, suffer many things at the hands of murderous usurpers, and have ignorant companions who fail the hero. According to Macdonald, Mark has reworked the story of Odysseus and the Cyclops into the story of Jesus encountering the demon-possessed Gerasene, the appearance of Odysseus to Telemachus, into the Transfiguration, the meal Odysseus and his crew share before their journey to Hades, into the Last Supper, and many other stories. But since Mark's Gospel ends differently than it does in the Odyssey, Macdonald claims that Mark abruptly switched to following the account of the death of Hector in the Iliad. Luke allegedly picked this up and made even more parallels in his books. Macdonald notes ancient students mainly learned to write through a process of mimesis. This is where an author would imitate an earlier work in their own unique way. This wasn't seen as plagiarizing, as many today would assume. It was rather more about transforming earlier texts into something new. Such a practice was common among ancient students, and Homer's epics were often used. Macdonald says, imitations of Homer were common in prose as well. Students learned to imitate across genres, especially by paraphrasing epic into prose. Thus, Macdonald makes the bold claim that Mark and Luke Acts were part of this practice and were merely imitating Homer. The earliest evangelist was not writing an historical biography, as many interpreters suppose, but a novel, a prose anti-epic of sorts. However, as noted, when Macdonald's ideas have been reviewed, scholars have found numerous issues. In fact, there are too many to cover in this video. First, Macdonald asserted that Mark expected his readers to recognize his imitations of Homer. Unless these criteria are flawed or applied inappropriately, one conclusion seems inescapable. Mark imitated Homeric epics and expected his readers to recognize it. But as Margaret Mitchell noted, it is strange this understanding has been missed for almost 2,000 years, just for Macdonald to discover the real intentions of Mark and Luke. He even acknowledges this reading has been missed. Readers for 2,000 years apparently have been blind to this important aspect of Mark's project. So according to Macdonald, Mark created a theological fiction. This was evident to Luke, who built on him by imitating Homer in many other ways. But then suddenly, every church father and theologian after them missed this obvious meaning and interpreted the Gospels and Acts as intending to report history, until the modern era, when Macdonald caught something the overwhelming majority of experts missed for millennia. As Greg Boyd and Paul Eddy say, this problem is particularly acute, since to make his larger case, Macdonald argues that ancient authors could expect the readers to draw connections to Homer that are invisible to us. However, by his own admission, no one did. Ancient authors were aware of the practice of mimesis. Also, church fathers like Origen, Basil, and Gregory of Nazianzus wrote extensively on the Gospels and were well acquainted with Homer. Yet they, and everyone else, just happened to miss what Macdonald suggests is the obvious reading of the Gospels. This doesn't prove Macdonald is wrong, but circumstantially, it lowers the probability that he is correct. From the background knowledge, it is far more likely that the Gospels were never intended to be understood as imitating Homer. Second, we have real examples of mimesis from the ancient world, and everyone has been aware this is what they were intended to be. This is not the case with Mark or Luke. In the 4th century, Emperor Julian outlawed Christians from teaching the classics. Apollinarius responded by writing recreations of Old Testament narratives so Christians could read classic-like works. Sozomen wrote, Apollinaris therefore employed his great learning and ingenuity in the production of a heroic epic on the antiquities of the Hebrews to the reign of Saul, as a substitute for the poem of Homer. He divided this work into 24 parts, to each of which he appended the name of one of the letters of the Greek alphabet, according to their number and order. He also wrote comedies in imitation of Menander, tragedies resembling those of Euripides, and odes on the model of Pindar. Empress Eudocia Athenias wrote a poem where she borrowed lines from the Iliad and Odyssey to narrate the biblical story from Genesis to Jesus. At times, she quotes Homer verbatim. Carl Olof Sandnes notes, it is clear she was imitating Homer in various ways, even though many of the parallels to the Gospels she made were slippery and forced. Christians knew what mimesis looked like, and no one considered Mark or Luke Acts to be obvious examples. This is a surprising fact if Macdonald is correct. Sandnes draws attention to Virgil's Aeneid, an outstanding example of emulation of Homer. Macrobius noted it was common knowledge among the Romans that Virgil was imitating Homer. We can also look at Lucian's work, A True History, a satirical imitation of the practice of emulating Homer. He wrote a parody of a traveler's tale with himself as the main character, which drew heavily from the Odyssey. Throughout, Homer is not only alluded to, but directly cited. Sandnes notes this is a clear example of what imitation looks like, but adds that, in Mark's Gospel, no metatextual preparation for Homer's poems, no Homeric names, no Homeric quotations are found. The crucial question is, does it make sense to speak of subtle emulation when these characteristics of the genre are all absent? There is in Mark's Gospel no movement from obvious to subtle emulation of Homer's poems. This does not imply that no hypertext is advertised in Mark's Gospel. This Gospel does indeed advertise its hypotext in ways that are more or less identical with both the Aeneid and the true story. But the reader is directed not to Homer, but to the Old Testament. In other words, we have ancient examples of imitation of Homer's epics, and Mark's Gospel, as well as Luke's, does not resemble the examples we have, which makes the theory unlikely. Sandnes points out when an ancient text was imitating another, the author moved between advertising intertextuality and subtle emulation. This is why we know certain texts were imitating Homer. Mark and Luke never advertised intertextuality with Homer, so there is no reason to think New Testament authors were doing this. It is also surprising, if Macdonald is correct, that no Christian opponent ever brought this up. Christian opponents like Celsus and Lucian were looking for whatever they could to attack Christianity. If Mark and Luke were really imitating Homer, they could easily have dismissed the Gospels as novels that Christians mistook for historical works. But no such case was ever made. Seems like almost no one thought the Gospels were mimesis novels until Macdonald. Moreover, Loveday Alexander noted that Luke's prefaces do not fit with the style one would expect from an ancient epic. She adds, at the surface levels of discourse and narrative management, Acts is not an epic, and no ancient reader would suppose that it was. The evidence suggests Luke was writing a biography and a history, as his prefaces and overall writing style better fit with those genres. As Sandnes and Keener note, the Gospel author's primary sources were the Old Testament texts, which they used to connect to events from Jesus' life to show he was their fulfillment. The overwhelming majority of scholars Note the Gospels have a far more prominent connection to Jewish texts than to Greek texts. If they were trying to imitate Homer, then why rely so much on the Old Testament to show Jesus was the fulfillment of the Scriptures? One could merely ignore them and quote Homer extensively, as Virgil and Lucian did. But this is not what we see when we read Mark and Luke. And as noted, most scholars who have reviewed his work have thoroughly rejected Macdonald's theory. Steve Reese said, "In my view, Macdonald vastly overstates his case, which is built on dubious assertions and fallacious assumptions." Craig Keener says, "Although Homer is part of Acts' larger Greco-Roman context, most critics find Macdonald's emphasis on the pervasive allusion to Homer unconvincing, especially because of his search for a single decisive hypotext, an emulation that is not recognized, and in this work, neglect for the more explicit Old Testament intertextuality in Acts." Michael F. Bird said, "Macdonald's Mark imitating Homer thesis relies on several superficial parallels. Macdonald infers that once Mark characterized Jesus as one who suffered much, like Odysseus, he then found in the epic a reservoir of landscapes, characterizations, type scenes, and plot devices useful for crafting his narrative. That is a monumentous logical and literary leap of faith." It is impossible to cover all of Macdonald's examples, but we'll hit some important ones so you can see why the scholarly community remains unconvinced. What is likely going on is the phenomenon called parallelomania, which is when someone sees apparent similarities and then constructs parallels without a logical basis or evidence of a causal link. One is merely noticing things that look similar and assuming there is more than what is there. But similarities between different things often result by mere coincidence or are constructed by writers trying to find patterns. To begin, Macdonald draws attention to the fact that Mark says Jesus renamed the sons of Zebedee to the sons of thunder. He says this was meant to imitate Castor and Polydeuces from the Iliad, and lists several parallels that are supposed to connect them. But Macdonald's main argument is Mark is trying to make Jesus resemble Odysseus at this point in the Gospel. And Castor and Polydeuces were not companions of Odysseus. They were supposed to be already dead by the time of the Iliad and Odyssey. Margaret Mitchell says, "They are hardly similar to the narrative function of the living James and John in Mark's work, who followed Jesus from their father's boat to adventures in Galilee and even beyond the pages of Mark's narrative canvas." We also should note Mark never explains why Jesus changed their names. If he was trying to make a connection to Homer, this would have been the perfect time to expand on this parallel. One cannot read too much into a brief reference, as Macdonald seems to have done. His list of connections is also not convincing. The first one is far too general. They are sons of someone, so what? If Mark was writing fiction, he could have at least made the name of the father similar. The next one is also not the same. Castor and Polydeuces are called boys or lads. Sons has a different meaning. Argonauts were not fishermen, they were a band of heroes. James and Castor did not die the same way, and James' death is not even in Mark. If Mark was trying to imitate Castor, why did he leave out such an important detail? In Acts, James died by the sword, and so was most likely beheaded. Castor died by suffering a mortal wound from a spear because he was keeping watch in a tree while his brother was attempting to steal cattle. Mark also doesn't hint to the idea that John was thought to live to the second coming. In John's Gospel, he debunked this later rumor that is not present in Mark. Polydeuces did in fact ask Zeus to split immortality with Castor, but this is not close to what is in Mark, since they asked to sit at Jesus' right side and share in his glory. And finally, the last one is not a parallel, it is the opposite. So when we go through these alleged connections, we encounter numerous differences, and trying to make parallels from aspects that are way too general to be of any significance is not sufficient to demonstrate a connection. And the last one is not a parallel at all. Now Macdonald deals with this issue by appealing to transvaluation, which is when one takes a text and transforms it into something new, or the strategic replacement of the values of the targeted text with new ones. So allegedly, Mark could take something Homer said and change it to the opposite, and somehow it is still a parallel in Macdonald's eyes. He says, Mark did not merely mimic the Dioscuri, he transvalued or emulated them. Jesus refused the request of the sons of thunder for eternal honors. insisting instead on the importance of suffering. The obvious problem with this is it makes Macdonald's claims unfalsifiable. If differences can also be parallels, there is no way Macdonald can be proven wrong. As Margaret Mitchell said, Macdonald's reading of Mark, while ingenious, is for several interrelated reasons ultimately unconvincing as a recreation of historical, authorial intent. First, the strong reading relies too much on a have your cake and eat it too methodology, since in his argument, parallels between the two narratives support direct influence, but divergences do also, since they demonstrate that Mark was not just imitating, but emulating and transforming Homer. This means in essence that Macdonald's thesis, once propounded, is theoretically incapable of invalidation. Second, many of Macdonald's interpretations of particular passages are forced or contorted, rendered on the basis of inconsistent application of interpretive principles. We can see this in another place. Macdonald says the incident in Mark 5 of Jesus saving the demon-possessed man is an imitation of when Odysseus faced off with the Cyclops. Like before, Macdonald lists what he perceives to be several parallels, and argues Mark intentionally reworked the story. But Kristen Larson evaluated Macdonald's theory and demonstrated it is riddled with problems. Macdonald modified this list in later publications, but it's mostly the same, and since we are relying on Larson, we'll use this list as it's what he responds to in his paper. First, some of these alleged parallels are way too general. Jesus and his crew disembarked. What do you expect would happen if you got off a boat? In both, someone has asked for their name. Most people ask for names when they encounter someone new. At the end, the crew re-embarked and sailed away, which is how you would expect them to leave if they arrived on a boat. The second one is not a real parallel. Homer said that when Odysseus arrived at the island, and before they disembarked, therein lived wild goats innumerable, for the tread of men scares them not away. When Jesus arrived on the other side of the lake, which is not an island, Mark didn't say anything like this. He only notes there were 2,000 pigs later in the story to explain where the demons went. Notice this is not mentioned before they disembarked, and goats are not the same as pigs. If Mark was writing fiction, he could easily have written goats to imitate Homer. Macdonald deals with this by suggesting that Mark 5 also parallels the Odyssey Book 10, where Odysseus' crew is turned into pigs by Circe. Allegedly, when Odysseus' crew disguised themselves as sheep to escape the Cyclops, this foreshadowed them being turned into livestock. But the animals are not the same, and the foreshadowing is speculative. And also, this is a reoccurring problem. When the details don't match, Macdonald just asserts without evidence that Mark jumped to a different passage to imitate before jumping back to the main passage. You can make anything match if you cherry-pick the details. Number 4 is not a good parallel. The only similarity is they are both monstrous in some way, but Larson says, the giant was savage and lawless from the viewpoint of Odysseus, not from the viewpoint of his own community of Cyclops. The demoniac, on the other hand, was an outcast and seen as savage and lawless by everybody. The giant lived in a cave, whereas the demoniac lived among the tombs, which are merely caves. The setting is thus not a very distinct element of the parallel, and the characteristics of the antagonist differ. Macdonald is correct that tombs in Mark 5 were caves, but then why didn't Mark just say cave if he wanted his readers to know that he was imitating Homer? Why change it to tomb? Because of this, this cannot be a literary parallel. The fifth is hardly comparable. The Cyclops asked if Odysseus came to harm him, but the demoniac recognized who Jesus was and pleaded with him not to torment him. The Cyclops doesn't know who Odysseus is, which is not similar to Mark. The seventh parallel is not the same, and Macdonald would have to rescue this one by claiming transvaluation. The only similarity is there is naming at play. Odysseus says to the Cyclops, his name is nobody, but the demons say to Jesus, their name is Legion because they are many. One has to ignore the numerous amount of differences to make this a parallel. The eighth is also different since both heroes achieve victory differently. The ninth and 10th are not the same. The Cyclops calls out to his neighbors for help, but gets none because of Odysseus' trickery. In Mark, the swineherders go to the city for help, and the people beg Jesus to leave. There is nothing narrated in Mark that says the people came to ask about the pigs. Larson says, The neighborly response is a part of the Gerasene story that has no parallel in the Cyclops story. Furthermore, due to the scarce amount of narrative information characterizing the storytelling of Mark, the response of the Gerasenes comes across as a non-trivial story element. The next one is an odd comparison. Nothing in the Odyssey depicts the Cyclops as naked. This comes from later paintings of the story. Even if this was a valid parallel, Mark would not be imitating Homer's literary work, but a popular misconception. Furthermore, the demon-possessed man is clothed at the end, which is no parallel in Homer. Number 13 is not a real parallel. First, it's out of order because Jesus has not re-embarked at this point, but also it is not the same. Odysseus wants the Cyclops to tell everyone that Odysseus blinded him, which is nothing like what we read in Mark. Jesus tells the man to go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. Macdonald seems to have misunderstood what Jesus said. Larson says, "The cured man is instructed to tell his friends of God's mercy. This clearly does not entail proclaiming to the world what miracles Jesus has performed, whose safety after all depends on remaining anonymous. Contrary to the instructions of Jesus, the man goes off to the 10 Greek cities, not to his friends, and specifically relates what Jesus has done. So whereas Odysseus wants the antagonist to let his identity be known, the cured man reveals the identity of Jesus, contrary to the instructions." Number 14 is also incorrect. Mark does not say Jesus was aboard when the man asked if he could come with him. And this is obviously different than the Cyclops asking for Odysseus to return. Finally, refusing a request is way too vague to be a parallel. So as you can see, we can go through Macdonald's alleged parallels and encounter numerous problems. The order isn't exact, details are wrong or misrepresented, transvaluation has to be employed extensively to rescue alleged parallels, and Macdonald has to draw from the Odyssey Book 10 to strengthen his case. Furthermore, Larson has an even more damning critique. He lists the extent of the story in Mark side by side with the story in the Odyssey. Mark's story is about 2,000 characters, whereas in the Odyssey it's about 24,000 characters. This gives us a ratio of 1 to 12 in the number of characters, which means the average distance between parallels in the hypotext is 12 times greater than in the hypertext. When you have such a high amount of text, anyone can go through and cherry pick out similarities to what we see in Mark and then ignore the rest. The differences are far more extensive than anything that could be contrived to be a parallel. Also, the existence of similarities does not mean this is evidence of conscious imitation in Mark. Scholars have remarked on flaws of the contextual and qualitative dimensions of Macdonald's argument, particularly on the often vague nature of the parallels and the failure to demonstrate authorial intent. After all, influence or literary dependence is not the same as conscious imitation communicated to a contemporary audience. As noted, the Odyssey doesn't end with the death of the hero, so Macdonald has to claim that Mark shifted to imitate Hector from the Iliad. He finds parallels between the two heroes to support his theory. But again, he has to rely on transvaluation and shifts the order at times to make it work. But the bigger issue here is Macdonald cherry picks out similarities and ignores the differences to make his case. One cannot obtain a full picture without evaluation of both. As David Litwa said, to focus on pure similarity is parallelomania. To focus on difference is apologetics. Stephen Boyce went through the two accounts and listed the similarities and differences. He notes there are some similarities, which Macdonald highlights, but when we factor in the differences, we can see the two accounts are drastically different. In both accounts, authorities pass judgment that the hero should die. But in the Iliad, Zeus hesitates because of the countless sacrifices Hector has made, whereas Pilate finds no fault with Jesus. Pilate tried to offer a substitute, whereas Zeus did not. And of course, Pilate was just a prefect. Zeus was a god. Macdonald notes both Hector and Jesus were given mixed wine. But what the wines were mixed with is different. Hector was offered honey wine and Jesus was offered sour wine. This also occurs for Hector at a much earlier place in the Iliad, and he was offered the wine because he was wearied by toil and not about to die. Also, the primary reason he was offered the wine was so he could give the first portion to Zeus as an offering. Hector refused, but Jesus accepted. Taunts are hurled at both, but Hector insulted Achilles first, which finds no parallel in Mark. Hector also did this during his battle with Achilles, which is unlike Jesus' trial and execution. The context in which the taunting takes place is completely different than what we find in Mark. This is cherry-picking out one similarity and ignoring a plethora of differences. Hector calling out to his brother is only vaguely similar to bystanders presuming Jesus called out to Elijah. If Mark was imitating Homer, he would have had Jesus call out to Elijah, or perhaps his own brother James. Hector was asking for backup, which is not a parallel to anything in Mark. Both do die with a loud cry, but the spirit of Hector goes to Hades, which is not said of Jesus, who only breathed his last breath. Hector also tried to reason with his killers, and Jesus did not speak to them. Jesus was also given a proper burial by a wealthy follower, and Achilles refused at first to allow one for Hector. Macdonald says both use the phrase from top to bottom, but the Iliad is referring to Troy burning, and Mark is talking about the temple curtain. This is simply cherry-picking one similarity out of a plethora of differences. The Greek phrase in Homer is in classical Greek, not Koine Greek, and Mark doesn't appear to be trying to imitate it. There is nothing else in this alleged parallel to form any kind of connection, since Mark doesn't narrate the later fall of Jerusalem. Macdonald interprets the centurion's statement not as an acknowledgement that Jesus was divine, but as if he was gloating or mocking Jesus. This is an odd interpretation that is speculative, which most scholars reject. It doesn't fit with the context of the centurion witnessing the effects of Jesus' death, like the temple curtain tearing or the darkness. Sandnes points out the Empress Eudocia, in her poem, was writing about the crucifixion and imitating Homer, and she didn't interpret this as a gloat, when it would have been easy for her to make such a connection. After all, she was drawing from Homer and the Gospels, and didn't see this as a gloat, which makes Macdonald's interpretation even more unlikely. Macdonald is correct, women are present when both heroes die, but for Mark, he has to say the women presumably lamented. This does not work because Macdonald wants to argue that Mark is consciously imitating Homer. From the text of Mark, we see no statements about the women lamenting, so how can he argue Mark is imitating Homer if we can only presume the women lamented? Sandnes says, it is unwarranted though that this scene is the source of the Markan story, and that the similarities pointed out by Macdonald are his inventions. Boyce lists even more differences in a document linked below. Like with Mark 5, when we go through the differences, they pile up and outweigh the similarities. If Mark was imitating Homer, we should expect to see more explicit connections or direct quotes. Instead, one can only cherry-pick out vague generalities, ignore the differences, and appeal to transvaluation when the parallels don't exist. As David Litwa said when speaking of another alleged parallel Macdonald tries to make. Macdonald creatively rearranges and tweaks most of his parallels in order to fit the structure of his often extensive lists and charts. One example is Jesus walking on water. Macdonald compares this passage with Homer's Iliad 24, 340-46, and Odyssey 5, 43-55. But in these Homeric passages, Hermes and Athena never actually walk on water, they fly over it. We can find similar problems when Macdonald tries to find imitation in the Book of Acts. In the Odyssey, Odysseus lives through 2 shipwrecks. Macdonald suggests Luke's account of Paul living through a shipwreck is fiction, imitating the 2 accounts in the Odyssey. Steve Reese, who has a background in classics, evaluated Macdonald's theory and found numerous issues. To start, Macdonald notes the voyage is told in first person, as if the author was there with Paul. He argues the account in Odyssey books 9-12 are also told in first person, so Luke must be trying to imitate that, and sea voyages were often written in first person. But Reese notes 2/3 of the Odyssey is in first person discourse, and much of the Iliad is as well. It was common in Greek literature to write in first person and from the character's own perspective. This was not unique to ship voyages. In Acts, the other we passages do not always involve a sea voyage, so this simply doesn't work. Reese says, there is of course a much simpler explanation. Both the Odyssey and Acts include first-person discourse because those telling the stories in their own voices were present, or at least claimed to be present at the events. Macdonald emphasizes that the we passages of Acts are all associated with Troas, which is supposedly a mere 10 miles from ancient Troy. Allegedly, Luke did this to connect Acts to Homer's epics. But Rees responds, Homer's Troy, a Bronze Age inland city, and Luke's Troas, a major Hellenistic and Roman seaport, widely known as Alexandria Troas, are not the same. It may seem a minor point, but Troas is more than a mere 10 miles from Troy. It is actually 15 as the crow flies, and it would have been more than that by land travel in antiquity. In fact, Troy and Troas were a full day's journey apart. Luke would not have been able to invoke the citadel of Homeric Troy in the minds of his ancient audience simply by mentioning the Hellenistic Roman seaport of Alexandria Troas. Furthermore, it is not true that all the we passages revolve around Troas. The first one does begin in Troas, but plays no part in the narrative. Instead, the narrative is about events in Philippi. The second we passage does involve events in Troas, but the third and fourth have nothing to do with the city. Macdonald tries to get around this last one by saying that the ship that Paul was on was from Adramyttium, which supposedly was a port city in Mysia in the same general region. But in reality, Adramyttium is 50 miles southwest of Troas. As Rees says, Macdonald has played fast and loose with the details here to serve his purposes. He has perhaps misidentified the ancient port of Adramyttium with the modern Turkish town of Edremit, an inland city in the northeast, which is named after ancient Adramyttium. Here, as elsewhere, Macdonald has manipulated the details in large and small ways to buttress his proposal, as a result, vastly overstating the evidence in support of his extravagant conclusions. Many of the details Macdonald highlights as evidence of a connection are far too general and would be standard language one could use when speaking of a sea voyage that ended in a wreck. Fearing disaster would be natural, as it often occurred on the sea in the ancient world. Odyssey Book 5 mentions the winds of all four cardinal directions. So when Acts mentions a south wind or northeast wind, one could easily find a parallel and ignore the wind directions that are not mentioned. Many of the other alleged parallels have to be rescued by transvaluation to make them fit with Macdonald's conclusion. Rees notes the language found in both accounts is pretty common in ancient texts of sea voyages. He says only a few are unique, but notes even these events are shared by multiple stories of sailors throughout history. We may think it's unusual that both Paul and Odysseus were thought to be gods, but it is not so for the ancient mindset, as it was repeated throughout many works, and it was often assumed by ancient people that multiple gods moved about. Finally, Rees notes the order is not exact here either. Macdonald has to play with the sequences to fit with his conclusion. In his eagerness to support his underlying premise, Macdonald selects certain details and omits others from several different Homeric episodes. Here are the episodes of the storms at sea in Odyssey 5, 12, and 14. And then he rearranges the sequence of details so that it matches up with the sequence of events in Acts 27, even displaying the sequences tidily side by side in two columns. This practice results in a ship-shaped presentation, but it also significantly distorts the evidence. Unfortunately, this has become Macdonald's modus operandi in all his subsequent work on Homer in the New Testament. Similar issues result from other passages that Macdonald tries to connect to Homer. The critique can be applied by analogy to Macdonald's next 20 years of publications on the topic of Homeric influence on the New Testament, all of which contain similarly extravagant claims built on a foundation undermined by flaws and distortions. As I said, you can make anything match if you cherry-pick similarities, ignore the differences, and distort what is left. In reality, we can often find parallels because history is filled with an abundance of stories, fiction and non-fiction. If one looks hard enough, you'll find parallels that came about just from the fact that we have an abundance to draw from. If we return to the parallels between Jesus and Hector, Mike Licona responds to this by also finding parallels to the death of Pompey. One can easily go through the account and see we can find similarities to both Jesus and Hector, but no historian would suggest the similarities mean the assassination of Pompey was a fictional account. So even if Macdonald was correct in his assessment, this would not mean the Gospels are fiction. We covered this in more detail in 2 other videos, but we know ancient historians often wrote about current events in a way that mimic fictional stories or past events. Julius Caesar and his army faced off against Pompey's army. One opposing soldier came forward and taunted Caesar's army. One of Caesar's soldiers went out and accepted the challenge, but they were evenly matched, and Caesar recorded, "It was like the traditional encounter between Achilles and Memnon." Julius Caesar witnessed a real-life event, but wrote about it in a way to parallel something from fiction. Mark Beck wrote, "It appears evident that structurally, Lucian modeled his life of Demonax on Xenophon's Agesilaus. This does not mean Lucian intended for his audience to read his biography as fiction." Rhiannon Ash noted Seneca may have committed suicide in a certain way to mirror how Socrates died. Ash also notes Tacitus wrote in a way to echo already existing structures and accounts. The historian Socrates of Constantinople wrote about Hypatia and Origen in a way to mirror each other by highlighting similarities and ignoring differences. Often ancient writers would write about real-life events in a way to parallel already existing stories and structures. This in no way implies what they wrote was meant to be fiction. So even if the Gospel authors wrote about Jesus in a way to intentionally parallel Homer, that would not even get us to the conclusion that this means the Gospels are fiction. As Greg Boyd and Paul Eddy say, one could plausibly argue that Mark saw in certain aspects of Jesus' life, incidents and episodes, that paralleled or echoed Homeric themes, and allowed the parallels to shape the telling of the Jesus story. In fact, given the sporadic nature of parallels that Macdonald believes he has identified, it is far more likely that if his theory is true, the New Testament writers were writing about historical events and just finding parallels in Homer to fit with the already known stories about Jesus. We know they did this with the Old Testament. They would witness or hear about something Jesus did, and they would look for an Old Testament passage to compare it with. It was not like they were crafting fiction from the Old Testament. It is more likely Jesus did something, and people looked for an already existing parallel to compare it with. If Macdonald is right, and the New Testament authors did this with Homer as well, a simpler explanation is they were only looking for known parallels to compare with historical things that Jesus and Paul did. In fact, this would only make the Gospels even more genius, but not any less historical. And as we noted, we covered this idea more extensively in these other 2 videos. And we have a whole series pointing out the Gospels are most likely historical biographies. To be clear, we're not saying there was no influence from Homer on the New Testament. Homer saturated the culture of the ancient world, and it would be hard to find any text that didn't have some influence from Homer, merely from the fact that his epics greatly shaped the culture of that day. But Steve Reese points out any influence on the New Testament is best explained as indirect, and surprisingly slight. Merely finding subtle or indirect allusions to Homer in the New Testament is a far cry from Macdonald's extravagant theory that they were directly imitating Homer. Merely finding vague parallels divorced from their context is not sufficient to make his case. In conclusion, Macdonald's thesis is based on convoluted assumptions, misrepresentations, unfalsifiable claims, and logical leaps. It is riddled with problems and is likely to be just another case of parallelomania. But even if he is correct, it doesn't get him to his conclusion that the Gospels are fiction, since we know authors often connected real-life events to already existing stories and structures. The whole project ultimately fails.